for best practices in pro bono, using AI to further access to justice. Where do we start? So I'm also excited to see that we have a spectrum of folks with different various levels of experience with AI, but we are certainly looking at the poll results coming in at mostly zeros and ones. So we are in a safe space for talking about initial considerations. Where do we start when thinking about AI? As Christina already mentioned earlier when you were joining, it's here. We can't avoid confronting this reality. It is here, it is developing quickly. And so what are the conversations that we should be having with one another? How do we stay educated? How do we responsibly consider the risks, but not let them stand in the way of the benefits and the opportunities? So we're going to dig into those questions today with our panel. We have a varied panel that you heard from some of these panelists in the last session in May. If you attended, there was a recap and various resources from that panel in your registration email. And as Christina said, we'll be sending a follow-up after today's session. So you'll be able to check out things that you missed from before while we continue the conversation today. So I'm excited for you to hear directly from these panelists. They have different experiences and views and perspectives on the use of AI. And so let's start picking their brains. So I would like the panelists to introduce themselves, and then just share with the group what your experience has been learning about and using generative AI. And just as a reminder, when we're talking about generative AI, we're talking about that AI that is used to create new content. So start with you, Michael. Can you introduce yourself, please, and share your experience so far?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Michael Lukens. I'm the executive director at the MICA Center for Immigrant Rights, formerly, as of like 3 weeks ago, CARE Coalition. We just changed our name. We have, and I think you'll note over the next hour and a half, I am the dissenting voice on this panel. I am very untrusting of AI. We have a policy in place here at Amica Center forbidding most uses of AI with client work. And I have a lot of concerns both about the use of AI in general access to justice fields, but also, and I'll put a link in there, a really good article just came out from one of our peer groups about 2 AI programs that are now being used by the government to try and screen people for things like asylum. And while I am optimistic that one day AI will help us solve some of our problems, I'm also very scared that right now it's being used irresponsibly by people in power, and that makes me very scared.
Thank you, Michael. Next, going to Tiana. If you can introduce yourself, Tiana, and share your experience with AI so far.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tiana Russell. I'm pro bono counsel at Crowell & Moring. I consider myself kind of the newbie voice on this panel, so I've been really excited to be learning a lot more about AI. And quite frankly, this session and the one I previously participated in has really prompted me to engage with our compliance officers, with our innovation teams, and also with some of you in the audience today at legal service groups to think about how Crowell can better use AI in its pro bono work. So very excited to talk today and about the uses of AI, but come to it with a lot of humility, as I think many of us do, as it's so rapidly evolving and changing.
Thank you so much, Tiana. And Jim, thank you so much for joining us again. If you don't mind introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your experience.
Hi, I'm Jim Sandman. I'm Vice Chair of the District of Columbia Access to Justice Commission, and I'm a Vice Chair of the American Bar Association's Task Force on Law and Artificial Intelligence. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Last semester, I taught a seminar called Generative Artificial Intelligence and Access to Justice. I have some background in legal services. I was president of the Legal Services Corporation for 9 years. I've spent most of my career in private practice in a big law firm.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm so excited to have this panel here. I have to say there was such a rich discussion at the last session, which prompted us immediately to schedule a part 2, if you will, for today. And our prep discussion with the panelists was incredibly rich. So we have a lot to dig into today. The next question that I want to pose for all of our panelists is, for those of us in the audience, which is most of us, just beginning to think about AI use and implementation and aren't sure where to start, what are some of the considerations that you think are critical to the conversation? And if you have tips for starting, Tiana, I'll start with you. You talked about how some of these conversations have prompted you. What have been some of the considerations that you think have been important and are important for others, and maybe some tips for folks getting started?
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so I'll really be speaking to this from kind of the law firm perspective. I think first of all, it's to engage with if you do have an innovation officer or compliance team, to start those conversations. Our firm has been using generative AI and has its own kind of, I think, protected version of it, of Gen AI called Kroll AI. And it's also shared a number of training modules and other directions and compliance suggestions in using AI, particularly with client-facing work. So I started using it really internally. I think that's how a lot of law firm attorneys are using it initially, or being directed to use it, is to start to use it internally facing. So if you have to really quickly draft a summary for a client alert or something like that, but not really client-related work. But these panels actually prompted me to reach out to my compliance officer and talk about potential ways that we could expand Kroll's use of AI in its pro bono project. And I frankly was really surprised by the level of excitement and support for that. A lot of the kind of messaging that we receive at law firms is, be so careful. There are these issues, there are confidentiality issues, there are client consent issues, and a host of other issues, which initially made me think like, oh, I better just stay away from Gen AI. But when I raised it with kind of our leadership team, they were like, we want to be expanding and doing more, both with Gen AI generally, but also in the access to justice and pro bono space. So I was met with a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of support in those efforts.
That's great. Are there things that, when you talk about client consent, confidentiality, how is the firm sort of considering that? What do those conversations look like?
Yeah, so frankly, I think we're really thinking about what is the best model for consent? So opt-in versus opt-out. I've heard some note that, why are we even seeking consent at all when we're not seeking consent to use these other platforms that are, maybe equally problematic. And so at least at my firm, there are still discussions around those issues. I suspect that in many law firms and other groups, there are still discussions about what is appropriate and how to best thread that needle. I'd be curious to hear from Michael and Jim on their views on that.
It's an interesting issue, right? Because we don't know what we don't know. AI systems are historically and notoriously a black box. They are using the information provided to them to get smarter, which is Jetsons fantastic. It's very cool, but it is not the same as putting your client's data into Westlaw, for example, right? We know Westlaw probably stores search history somewhere, and there's cookies, etc. But a well-designed generative AI system is taking information and making judgments about it, right? There are a number of things that can be done with your client's information. So, for example, at Amica Center, we do not allow our staff to use generative AI systems of any kind when it includes confidential information of their clients. It is not clear how that information is going to be used. And frankly, I don't think any of us could even try and answer it, because if you read the literature, a lot of the designers don't know exactly how the AI systems are using information. When you talk about alignment, human intervention into AI, that just makes things worse. Again, I'm optimistic that at some point this will be figured out. But at the moment, and I think if you read like the DC and the California and other ethics opinions, they're also trying to figure out what does this mean for confidentiality. That is, to me, like the black box problem is a real issue when we talk about our clients. And I do think, to Tiana's point about like opt in, opt out, it is different if your client is Google or Amazon or Accenture versus someone who is coming to you for pro bono support, who may not have any other options. It's a very different power dynamic when you talk about what can people really consent to when they're signing an engagement letter.
Well, I know in part of our call, we talked, someone, I think, Jim, you spoke about risk assessment, high and low risk. This might be a moment if you'd like to speak to that or other considerations when people are just getting started.
Yeah, I draw 4 lessons from my experience so far with artificial intelligence, and particularly generative artificial intelligence. The first is generative AI is not one thing. Broad statements about it, that it violates client confidentiality, it violates client privacy, it is biased. Broad statements like that, I think, are inappropriate. The extent to which those concerns are valid depends on the particular AI tool you're using and the use to which you are putting it. So when Tiana raises the question about client consent, my question is client consent for what purpose? How are you using the AI? I can imagine uses of generative AI where it'd strike me as kind of silly to get client consent. So I caution against thinking too broadly. And this is part of, not knowing what you don't know and getting up to speed. How do I know what the different AI tools are, and how do I know how to assess the risks and benefits of particular uses? But that's the direction we need to be going in. So point number 1 is AI is not one thing. The risks and benefits depend on the particular tool and the particular use. Second, I think the least risky use of generative AI is what they call extractive AI. And what extractive AI means is that in responding to a question, a prompt, the AI is not drawing from the internet. It's not drawing from the world outside your universe. It's drawing from a limited set of information that you have controlled. I'll give you an example. There's a chatbot AI tool in use at Cornell Law School's housing clinic called Teny, T-E-N-Y. You just Google Teny, T-E-N-Y, Cornell Law School housing, and you'll come up with it. And it draws on information that the law school clinic collected for a tenant rights handbook. It has information about the law in that part of New York. But it's all curated information that they created. The responses to the questions that you put in the chatbot are coming not from the internet. They're coming from the tenant rights handbook assembled by the clinic. I think that's pretty low risk. I also think that, particularly in the field of extractive generative AI, using it for purposes like summarizing large volumes of information. You can put in a whole bunch of PDFs and ask it to summarize them, synthesizing information, simplifying information. In my experience, generative AI is better at communicating than many lawyers are. I'll give you an example. I think I mentioned in the last session that the DC Access to Justice Commission has a project going on to try to synthesize all of the self-help information that's been created over years by the dozens of legal services organizations that we have in DC, to pull it all together. And in assessing what's out there, it's been determined that a lot of it is written at a grade level much higher than you want to be using for self-help purposes. It's at a high school grade level or sometimes even higher. Generative AI communicates in basic plain language. that anybody can understand. Not to say that it's always 100% accurate, but it does a good job of something like that. So think about using extractive AI for its relatively low risk and high utility. Third, remember, AI is an assistant. It's not a brain transplant. It is something that you use alongside your work. It's not something that you just turn loose and accept whatever it generates. You review it, you second guess it in the same way that you would review the work of a colleague who has done a first draft for you. And I think that mindset can be very helpful. And finally, I think what I've learned is that in discussions like these, it's really helpful to enlarge the tent and to bring more people to the table, particularly people who have more in-depth knowledge about generative AI. So what I would love to see the Washington Council of Lawyers doing, for example, is pulling in the AI experts, the tech experts in law firms across DC to talk about how the law firms, without getting into confidential matters, how the law firms are using generative AI in their day-to-day practices for their commercial clients. There are a lot of lessons that can be drawn from that. They should have a seat at the table. We shouldn't be thinking about the use of AI for legal services, for pro bono, as something different from the use of AI in other aspects of the practice of law. It's all about the delivery of legal services. There's a lot of commonality there and a lot of lessons that we can learn from our colleagues on the for-profit side of the practice.
I absolutely agree. I'll just weigh in, Jim, that was so helpful because I do think we talk about Gen AI and I've learned, there's so many, we mean so much by that. So it's really helpful to be specific. I also want to acknowledge, like from the law firm perspective that, and I speak from my experience, I feel like we have a little bit more of the added benefit of some guardrails that are kind of in place already in using it. So I have a tech team that I can ask questions about. I have, a compliance officer is giving every day giving thought to these issues. And so I have felt a little safer in wading in, knowing, okay, these people are really thinking carefully about confidentiality issues and these other issues. So Jim, I absolutely agree, inviting like tech individuals from law firms to speak, but also see a lot of opportunity in partnering with legal service organizations. So our law firm is putting a lot of thought into these issues and is also really welcoming of partnering with, legal service groups. And so think that can be a really useful synergy in this work.
So as we're thinking about all of the things to consider and things to talk about and where to start, you all gave such great examples of what you're doing in your own offices and practices. So we heard a lot just now about thinking through client-facing work, thinking about the process of just editing and reviewing the work that comes out. What platform are you using? Is it extractive to the point that Jim was making, and kind of balancing, the specificity can help us balance maybe some of the fears of what may come just from the internet or, some of these particular platforms. I know in I believe our last session, but also in our prep session for sure, we talked about the cost. And I think in our last section, we actually did talk about some of the subscription fees and things like that. And we had received a question from someone, in advance, just asking if there's AI software that's recommended. Is it worth paying a subscription, to get a better virtual assistant or platform use? And so to Jim's point of having folks who are in for-profit spaces with resources, and to Tiana's point too, partnering, we do want to think about the resource gap between our law firm institutions and legal services organizations that may not have even its own IT team for day-to-day operations, much less for focusing on things like generative AI. So in all of these considerations, and then getting to this question that was submitted in advance, is there AI software that's recommended? And are there thoughts on this cost issue and the discrepancy of resources? Anyone want to take that one?
I can say from the cost issue, we don't have, most nonprofits don't have money in their budget to be finding either off the shelf programs or creating our own extractive programs. But as much as I have consistently said, I don't want people using this for client work, I fully encourage my staff for using the free options for, like, I use it for writing law school reference letters. It's incredibly helpful, and making agendas. And I know our comms team has used it on a number of cases, but they're using the free versions. Um, I I would, love to see one of the bigger groups provide some nonprofit options. I think that would be incredibly interesting. But at the moment, like, cost is very prohibitive. And I am fascinated by the idea of an AI at Amica Center using AI to streamline HR operations. And we're talking to one of our Fortune 500 supporters who has an AI system and program. Because I don't know how many of you have gone to the HR department, but they are typically swamped and grumpy because people ask the same questions over and over again. And you can only say, please read the manual so many times. So like that is something I'm fascinated by, the idea of an internal AI HR system. So that is, but if it was expensive, it wouldn't be a priority for us.
I think for law specific AI, you should pay. Don't use generic tools for that. So something like Thomson Reuters Westlaw Co-Counsel, that's worth paying for. Do not use generally available tools to do legal research. That's a mistake. That's what results in hallucinated cases. That's what gets you sanctioned. Don't do that. For more generic uses, the latest version of ChatGPT 4.0 is really good and a significant improvement over the initial rollout of ChatGPT 18 or 20 months ago. That comes recommended by people like Dean Andy Perlman at Suffolk Law School in Boston, which is a leader in the use of technology in legal services and in access to justice. He's a fan of, I don't want to speak for him, but for other risks that you're trying to address, confidentiality, privacy, things that law firms are taking account of and the systems that they design for internal use, that costs. And those kinds of protections are necessary if you're going to be entering client-specific information that's going you don't know where.
I absolutely agree. And I'll second Michael's comment, though, about kind of back office and admin work. I mean, I think there's such a learning curve with AI. And so what we're hearing is like so much of the benefit is just freeing us up to do really the critical thinking skills and legal advising that we need to do. And so if you can take off so much of us, half of our job feels like admin kind of, BS sometimes. And so if you can utilize AI in those ways, I think it can help in first just making you more familiar and seeing both the strengths and the weaknesses, because so much of it is familiarity and knowledge about smart prompt usage and those issues. And so definitely think that that's really a great starting point to using AI. In terms of I agree with Jim, you should be paying for your AI. And I think of AI where I'm seeing the most benefit right now in my practice is summarization. The blank page problem, which is, I need to write an email out to the rest of the attorneys at the firm, saying something, let me just have it do its first draft. And then the third where I see really immense possibility is translation and interpretation. So that we use a platform called DeepL. And just recently I fed it a 30-page Know Your Rights presentation and asked it to translate it into Spanish, and it did it in 10 seconds. So I think that's also something that's really critical and could be a real asset of kind of AI learning. And I honestly, I don't even know if that, quite frankly, is totally AI, but translation, I think, is a real avenue of growth.
Is DeepL something, Tiana, that comes with a cost? Is that a subscription that the firm's paying for, if you know?
DeepL is a subscription that the firm's paying for. I checked online. I haven't talked with a salesperson. It seemed like pretty reason. I mean, I'm at a firm, so I recognize that what is reasonable might vary. But they are a subscription service, but from what I could tell, not astronomically high. And you can like have users, but I thought that was an incredible one. I should give a caveat to Jim's point that of course you always need a pair of human eyes. So for example, the PowerPoint that we did, we then had someone look over, but it turned what I think would have been a 5-hour translation job or a couple-hour translation job into like a 20-minute. And they caught a few mistakes, like parties was festas, like parties to the complaint was festas instead of, litigation parties, stuff like that. But overall, a very accurate and fast result.
We all get
Jen, can I
24
answer
hours in a day. Go ahead, Michael, sorry.
To answer the question in the chat about Westlaw, it does concern me a little bit. There was a study just done out of Stanford that even the Westlaw and Lexis AI systems were giving inaccurate results. It worries me a lot less because it is a closed universe, but both companies are not making public the way that their vectoring systems work. And I'll put a link to an article about the study. But it also worries me a lot less because I feel like we are trained as lawyers and advocates to do our diligence when it comes to research. And also, like, from a very provincial standpoint, there's not a ton of things that we cite in a lot of asylum and SIDG briefs. I can see Andrea smiling. There's not a ton of complex legal research that I think my staff is doing other than the impact litigation shop. I think if you were practicing in an area where research is much heavier, I would have some more concerns. But I feel like going through the Board of Immigration Appeals, I would bet dollars to donuts that Andrea could cite to us, as well as Lexis, the things we should cite in a gender-based asylum claim. Not that I'm going to ask her to do that.
Thank you so much. Well, that just you all touched on some of the uses and benefits. There was a lot of discussion about whether you start with some of the administrative tasks, to Tiana's point, free up our time to do the work that is really for lawyers. And if you're not trusting the systems, or you only have access to, free platforms and don't have the more sophisticated resources, what are some other opportunities that we haven't talked about for increasing access to justice, and kind of combining a question that we received from someone in advance? What areas of pro bono work or legal services work do you think could benefit the most from AI, at least in your experience and view today? Anyone want to kick that one off, or maybe I'll turn to you, Jim. Do you have thoughts on other opportunities we haven't discussed so far?
I do. I think the single best educational tool is what they call use cases, real life examples of what people are currently doing safely and confidently with generative AI. After the last session, I circulated an article that 2 professors at Berkeley had written, giving 100 use cases for legal aid, AI use cases for legal aid. We need a lot more of that. But I wouldn't limit the use cases that we talk about to legal aid. As I said, I think we should broaden this discussion. So when the question comes up, let's talk about what AI can do in pro bono. I don't think of it that way. I think about how can AI help in law. Pro bono is just a subset of law. And I think we need to talk about what thoughtful, careful people in all segments of legal practice, in law firms and corporate legal departments, are doing with generative AI that might provide helpful use cases, a little bit different in their manifestation, but the basic concept is something that people can look at and say, yeah, I could make use of that. there's a yearning for information about what all this means, and there's no better way to make it concrete than to give people real life examples of how people are currently using it successfully. So we need to create forums to make that happen, and to do it with some frequency. It's changing all the time.
Yeah, I can talk about some of the ways we're thinking about using it. So one way we've used it is, again, summarization. So we have used it here at Kroll, like in summarizing expert reports, an initial summarization of like voluminous expert reports or congressional testimony. And I think that can be a really helpful use. In terms of how we are thinking about using it, we are thinking about using it in terms of summarizing with consent, and we're still in the process of making sure that we have all the appropriate guardrails. But client intakes, for example, so where we're taking voluminous notes, someone's taking voluminous notes and then being able to better summarize those notes very quickly and do that much more fast. We're also, again, thinking about using it with the translation aspect of then being able to provide back to the client. Here's kind of what we talked about. Here's, a translation as well. And here's a summary as well of what we've talked about today. So that's something we're giving thought to. We've just started to think about creating more closed systems, to Jim's point, within particular, like legal service needs. So where we would, create a repository or a legal library that we could then access. We have not yet done that, but we're starting to try to brainstorm uses where that could be helpful, and giving a lot of thought to that as well.
Tiana, I know we talked in the last session and just separately about the use of prompts and develop, you were just mentioning a legal library, and I was thinking about a prompt library that we had talked about before. Could you share thoughts on that, and just for the group, your use of prompts thus far, what you've learned, what you're hoping to build?
Sorry about that. Yes, of course. So, as you all know, or those of you who've been working in AI, prompts are so key. Your kind of output is only as good as the prompts that you're putting in, and there is a skill to that. And I think a lot of the trainings are focused more on the risks or other issues, but are less focused on like the nitty gritty of how do you exactly prompt the computer. I think I sat in on a short panel where they talked, gave examples of very specific prompts, kind of how you direct it to use a certain tone, or kind of how you direct it to focus on certain articles. And I think that was really helpful. In our last discussion, we had talked about a prompt library, because I do think that prompts are iterative. So you'll kind of give an initial one and say, that's not what I wanted. Let me recalibrate that and re-enter that. So it really is a learn as you go, but I also would welcome, I don't know that we have time today, but getting someone from tech or someone with real expertise to just give examples of prompts. I found Adrian's prompts really helpful when he gave an example of, create a run of show for a presentation on this. And it was like it was a paragraph. The prompt was a paragraph. And I'm finding more and more, the longer your prompts, sometimes the better the results you get. And again, this is all from a very newbie perspective. So again, I say this, I think there's a lot of newbies in the room. So say all of this with a lot of humility, and that we're all kind of trying to figure this out as we go.
Can I answer another question that was in the chat?
Yes, please. I thought I was going to get back to you because I just assumed that's what you're maybe going to do, Michael, please.
Well, yeah, I want this and then build on what Jim was saying about working groups. So this idea of demographic data and discrimination, there are feedback loops, and actually the term feedback loop dates back to a paper about neural networks in the 40s, where a lot of well, not a lot, maybe 6 or 7 states are still using Compass, which is an AI tool to decide who gets bail, because it scores them, and they have found between that and predictive policing that certain neighborhoods that are, quote, high crime neighborhoods, people from there get a higher score. That leads police to think that they need to police more. So there's a real issue with feedback loops. Same thing with what we're seeing with USCIS and ICE. So yes, there are problems where a system that is creating racist results enforces its own results. But to Jim's point, like not only working groups on how do we use this, but working groups and um, I don't know what litigation shops on how do we stop the government from using this irresponsibly. Everybody's in this room because we're trying to figure out how do we do this in a way that's going to help people. Whereas, like the article I pointed to, USCIS is like, oh, we're just going to do it. So I would say I would love to also see working groups on how do we push back on that front? How do we make sure that AI is being used to help our clients and not in a way that's harmful? There's been, there's been litigation over Compass. There's been litigation over hurricane scores, which we talked about hurricane earlier, hurricane score about AI model about when people are able to get bond out of a immigration detention system. So those kind of working groups, I think, are going to be essential in the coming years.
Jim, did you have addition to that? I just saw you were off mute, so I wanted to check before. Okay, great. No, thank you. Thank you for all of that. Thanks for all of the questions that are coming through the chat. And we did want this to be really responsive and in response to things that were on your mind. So I actually am going to turn back to Jim for one of the questions because Michael mentioned hurricane, and I don't think I'm going to get this segue again. So one of the questions that was submitted in advance was, in light of the current season, what might be some ways that we can use AI to serve those impacted by hurricanes or other natural disasters? We need quick setup, effective issue spotting, resource referral connection, and case management assistance. Jim, do you have a few thoughts on that question?
I do, with a disclaimer. I wouldn't hold myself out as an expert on AI and hurricanes. But I do know something about AI and disaster relief. And one of the lessons is disaster relief is all about coordination with others. Whatever you're thinking about doing with AI in the context of hurricane relief, don't do it alone. Do it in coordination with FEMA, with the American Red Cross, with the ABA's Young Lawyer Section, which has a disaster response team, with local authorities on the ground. This has got to be coordinated. So find out who else is, and there may be some of those entities who have already thought this through and where you can just piggyback on what they're doing. But I can think of some sort of common issues that come up in disaster relief. Intake, forms completion, trend spotting. All of these are the kinds of things that I think AI can be helpful with. But you want to be sure that you're not setting up systems that are either duplicative of others or not open to others, that everybody is talking together about how to use these tools. But I think it's I think it's the right way to be thinking. I think that's a great question. There's a situation that requires quick response where the speed of AI can be very helpful in allowing you to help more people more quickly. Great question.
Yes, we received lots of great questions, and thank you all so much for submitting them and adding more to the chat. In terms of another question that we received from someone in advance was about training. So, this is we've kind of touched on this a little bit. We talked about this a little bit in, I think the last session and a prep session, just thinking about things that are important for using AI. We know things are changing. We know that there are lawyer skills that remain. So to the points that have already been made today about putting something in, you get that product out. You don't just run with it. To Jim's point, it's not a brain transplant. All of our panelists agree. You've got to review the work just like you're reviewing your own first draft or someone else's first draft. But maybe there are other skills that need to be developed, or maybe there are just other that might be trainings for lawyers, or just trainings that are important to promote the use. So that was another question that we received in advance, whether we're thinking about skills trainings as we consider implementation of AI in the legal community, or just promoting its use. Any of the panelists have thoughts on applicable trainings that are helpful or would be helpful, or just envisioned for the future?
I think legal research is going to be completely changed. I know I sound like a pessimist today, but I'm actually optimistic about the future. When I was in law school, which was like 18, 20 years ago, um, I spent my first semester learning how to do research with books. And if you showed up in court today and we're like, oh, I use books, the court would be like, okay, so that's just not okay, right? And I think we're going to get to a point where if you show up to court and say, I don't use AI because it scares me, they're going to say, well, that's not okay either. So starting to like Tiana's point about like how to use it, how to put the prompt in, it's not as simple as plug and play. Like starting to think about that in uses where like that you feel comfortable with is going to be important. I know Lexis and Westlaw, Case Text, they do trainings. So I think it's going to be important to train up the next generation of advocates on how to use this, just like we had to learn how to put in a search string in Lexis when we were in law school. Like, this is going to be incredibly important to learn.
I agree with that. And then also just trainings, to Jim's point, like we keep talking about AI, but there's so many different tools and so many different uses. And so I'm still very much trying to grapple with like, I asked our tech team to send me, how the firm's using AI, and it was like over 20 platforms of AI for very different uses. I keep thinking, I think when we talk about it, we think of this Gen A AI model, but there is a wealth of other uses. And so I think training around that is really helpful as well, because it can open us to, Michael, I loved your point about HR. Like that's something maybe people aren't thinking about, like, oh, this could have immense efficiencies in this kind of, something that might be overlooked. But if someone mentions, oh, we have these tools and these, we're using them, we can be giving more thought to how we can be using them at each of our organizations.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that we also had been talking about is just, are we at this window of opportunity? And so, Michael, both with his pessimism and optimism at the same time, we are acknowledging again today, confronting the reality that AI is here. It's only just evolving more and more quickly. And we're talking about, where do we start? What are the things we think about now? How do we keep up? And we discussed some in our prep for today's discussion, like what might a tipping point be? Is this the window of opportunity? How do we engage? Do we start small? Do we start where our resources are allocated? And so as we're just thinking about this overall picture, from where to start, what to be thinking about, how to do this responsibly. What are some additional thoughts from the panel before we move on to some other questions from the audience, just about keeping up with this ever-changing field, kind of broadening Jim's point of use cases and staying in conversation and community, and welcome, of course, chats from the audience as well, just to think about how do we do this? To me, I think as a newbie as well, it can feel very overwhelming. My initial reaction to Tiana saying over 20 platforms was, oh my gosh, sounds like a lot of letters and more alphabet soup, and I need a chart. And so just thoughts to the panel. What are thoughts about where we are now and how we do keep up with this field together? What can our community do to feel responsible and not miss what some of us are considering a window of opportunity?
I can start off. I saw Nancy's comment in the chat, and I think partnerships here can be like a real benefit. Again, some law firms might have more guardrails and more protections, but quite frankly, I think law firms are still looking for use cases, looking to try to expand out, and are at a time where they're really welcoming of clients or legal service organizations who reach out to them and say, we'd like to partner on this. So I do think there's a ability there for partnerships and for legal service groups or other groups to hopefully partner with law firms and take advantage of their paid resources, AI resources, to really achieve some great results. And to Michael's point, I mean, I think this is where we're heading, but I also really appreciate Michael's skepticism. I think there is kind of or not skepticism, but pointing out the issues. I think that we need to be thinking of it on both sides. It is where we're going, but it's kind of like the internet. Was that a net good or a net negative. I still don't know. I mean, and I think it's going to be kind of the same sometimes when we think about AI. I think that its potential for positive results is really high, but there are also a lot of negatives. And I'm seeing also some of the comments in the chat. Those are very welcome about some of the risks of translation. And so I do very much welcome and think we need to be thinking critically of it. But it also feels like it's here and there's no way we can escape it in some way. So we gotta be embracing it.
Hey, Jim, in your travels, building off that, and are you hearing that law schools are starting to integrate this into their curriculum, into training? I mean, whether we're at a tipping point today or in 15 years, it's like most technology going to be the new career attorneys come out of law school. Jim, are law schools typically starting to think through this? Sorry, Jen, I asked a question. I know that was your stepped in.
No, go for it.
Yes, but badly. Very unevenly, and to the extent that it's being taught, my strong sense is that it's being taught in elective courses, often in seminars. My own view is that starting in this fall, for the entering class, first-year class in every law school across the United States, training in generative AI should be part of the required first-year curriculum and legal methods, legal practice, whatever that first, legal research and writing, whatever they call that course, it should be integrated, both the risks and the benefits, so that people are thinking about this as they advance through the next 3 years. The class that starts this fall is going to graduate in 2027. And the notion that people will be coming out of law school in 2027 knowing nothing about AI, not having it integrated into the toolkit that they have to begin practice as lawyers, scares me. The challenge is, I don't know that law schools currently have the faculty and the staff to do the training. From my lips to God's ear. I mean, how in the world are they going to implement that this fall? That's not going to happen. But I think that's the way they should be thinking. But I think it's still kind of a niche thing. I think a lot of tenured faculty members think this doesn't have anything to do with them. They have tenure. They don't have to care. But I think that just to me, the analogy is computerized legal research. There came a point where that was absolutely essential. There was a time when law faculties thought that you needed to teach both the old-fashioned way of doing it and the new computerized way. They thought that people needed to learn to do it in hard copy books as what? No. Learn the lesson. So law schools are talking about it. It varies by law school, by the way. There are some law schools that are leaders in technology, a handful of them, that I think are being much more thoughtful about this. But across the roughly 200 law schools in the United States, I think it's very early days.
100% agree with you, Jim. I think it should be. I mean, I think you and I would come up with very different syllabi for that class. 100% agree. It should be. It's the thought of coming out in 2027 and not having a conversation about how to use it appropriately is terrifying. 100%.
I'd love to co-teach a seminar with you, Michael. We'd be a great team.
I will sign up for that class. So please tell me when that's coming out. This conversation makes me think about kind of getting to the skills that we're going to need. The fact that it is here. So if law schools aren't ready to be teaching on this and make it part of the curriculum, and you answered my question, Jim, the follow-up was going to be, do we have enough faculty to do this? If we did, if people were to be in agreement, do you have the expertise? But if firms like Tiana's and others, those with resources and with clients who may be more demanding about the use and implementation of generative AI, is there going to be, possibly a driver or motivator for law schools to change curriculum in response to the skill set that firms may be requiring? I don't know if anyone on the call or Tiana has thoughts about that, but if this does move forward and you have some law firms and corporations who are really digging into this and it becomes part of your practice, it would only make sense that, you want to build those skills in law school. So kind of more of the reason for us to stay in community with each other. I don't know, Tiana, do you have thoughts on that? Could you see from the law firm perspective, these being skills that you start looking for in recruitment?
That's a great question. Honestly, I think it's hard to gauge because time goes by so fastly. I think right now, no, but I very much see like in a couple of years, yes. I mean, I think it's gonna feel like light years changing very quickly. At law firms, we have the benefit of a lot of internal training. So to the training models, I mean, one thought I talked about with our team was like, can we offer some of our trainings externally to like legal service groups that we partner with and kind of, or more generally like our partners, because we've been putting money. So that's one thought we've been giving to some thought to. But agree, I think to Jim and Michael's point, there's it's really key to find the experts in this and get them platforms to talk about it, because it is where we're heading. And so many of us have still a very rudimentary understanding of it.
I think training from law firms would be amazing. I mean, let's like devolve the technology a little bit. We've had trainings for our paralegals on how to properly use Excel from law firms, right? And that was amazingly helpful. We've had law firms put on just Westlaw, Lexis legal research training. The resources for the legal service providers are so slim. Like you have your free PLI, but you only have so many hours in the day, and relying on our partners is incredibly important for us, because we just we don't have that kind of resource to work from, especially. And I'm saying this from a relatively large legal service provider here in DC. Like if you're a 5-person shop in Memphis, I just say that because I was just on the phone with somebody at a 5-person shop in Memphis. Like your resources are one whatever of what I have here in DC. So also thinking geographically, scope wise, in my mind, is also incredibly important.
Well, for those of you monitoring the chat, I just want to say, maybe something coming out of this group is we get the access to justice mandatory curriculum and build in some of the use and implementation of AI there. Maybe that's our place to start. So we have many potential faculty already on this call, obviously looking at Nancy as well. So yeah, this is great to be thinking of. We are just at about the end of our hour, and we promise more time for engagement and additional questions. I did want to circle back to one question about the unauthorized practice of law that was submitted in advance. And so that question is, what are the implications for AI for the unauthorized practice of law, online forms, non-lawyer navigators, etc.?
I just saw an article about this yesterday, which I'm going to put in the chat. But I can't talk and put it in the chat at the same time. So my general observation is that enforcement of unauthorized practice of law restrictions tends to happen a lot more against people than against things. And AI tools, I don't, that seems to, I'm not sure that the UPL authorities know what to do with things like that. But I look at something like LegalZoom, which ran into UPL problems in a number of states when they first came into business. They don't have those problems anymore. I think it was either North Carolina or South Carolina that initiated an enforcement proceeding against them. And I think LegalZoom threatened antitrust action against them, and they came to a settlement. And I think the terms of the settlement had something to do with lawyer oversight of the tool. So lawyer oversight can be a cure for a lot of things. The article I saw was about Minnesota, and it was applying Minnesota rules on unauthorized practice. There's a fair amount of, it's not universal, but there's a fair amount of uniformity across the United States in UPL concepts. So I think the site will be helpful. And I'll stop talking so I can put it in the chat.
Just a reminder that Washington Council of Lawyers has so many strengths, and one of those strengths is pulling together resources and sharing them out. So as you've heard several times, dropping this in the chat, just dropped that, there was a this, all of those things will be curated and sent out by Washington Council of Lawyers in the follow-up email. So fear not that you will have these resources available to circle back to. Chris, have I missed other questions? I just want to acknowledge other questions that may have come through that we could ask our panelists.
Yeah, so we have a few coming through. I think we've kind of touched on several of them, but I'll shout them out, and feel free if you think we've already covered it, we can go to the next. But one person was asking, Michael in specific, about using the AI through Westlaw. They were wondering if you have similar concerns to using a program like the one that Westlaw is offering. They recently went to a training on it.
So I think we answered that one.
Okay. Keeping up.
Yep.
Okay. And then next one, any concerns on different standards using AI for community rights or its client info? I know we talked about kind of synthesizing those community resources versus like actually creating client work product. If we want to touch on that.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. As I am attending convenings the last month or so, preparing for a potential change in administration. One of the themes has been legal service providers have little resources, but grassroots organizers on the ground have even less. And I do think that if done in a very thoughtful way, like a blank page problem, as Tiana said, it could be a good starting point of certain groups to get community information out. But again, I think we need to talk about this in two sets. One is your own use and whether it's helpful, but also the greater use of, if you are putting a ton of information into a large language model, what is that doing to the model, and is it making it worse? Are you contributing to the biases through a feedback loop? If you are constantly putting in data that connects immigrants and crime, then you are essentially teaching that large language model something you don't want to teach it. It is incredibly hard to know. There was a healthcare model about when someone with pneumonia should be kept overnight, and it started kicking out that people with asthma should be able to go home. And doctors are like, well, that's literally the opposite of what should happen. Well, it turns out it was just looking at the data and saying, well, people with asthma live. Well, it turns out they live because they're kept overnight by the doctors, right? So that AI model, that large language model, was creating these vector connections that were not true. So again, like using it thoughtfully with a lot of oversight and being aware of your and our participation in certain biases. But law firms have a ton of resources, then legal service providers, and then grassroots organizers. And we need all three in certain circumstances to help our clients. So thinking through all three steps there is important. I'm not sure if that even answered the question. Sorry.
It looks like it touched on the answer to the question, and then we have a little bit of a follow-up. The question about different standards for clients versus community is also directed at firms. Is what's okay for the general public also okay for paying clients?
Pat, could you come off mute and explain that
Yeah.
question a little bit? I don't think I'm following.
Yeah. So a lot of times in the nonprofit world, we have to make do with the resources we have, right? And it's interesting to hear firms saying, like, this is great for this kind of education or assistance. In other words, is this going to be like a second class, lower quality form of help? Or is it better than nothing? Which definitely I tend to think, right? And is that okay that some people get the tailored and attentive information and other people get something that a machine creates?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that,
mean,
I mean, that's the question.
that is a great, it's a philosophical question, right? Is it you can afford an attorney, you can't afford an attorney, but you find a pro bono because you happen to be lucky and live in DC and have all these amazing advocates. And then there's a whole class of folks that were like, sorry, you get the robot. I mean, that makes me very nervous from a legal cultural perspective. But then flip it over to your point, like, is that better than nothing? I don't know. Jim, what do you think? I'd imagine you have some thoughts.
I think the question is always compared to what, and we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Some competent help is better than no help at all. This happens all the time, and it happens in legal services. Who's going to get through intake? If you get through intake, what level of service are you going to get? Some get soup to nuts representation, others get brief advice and counsel. You do the best you can with what you have. But I think that giving people's, I mean, if you say robot, you know, that sounds bad. But allowing for the possibility that some AI help might be actually useful and definitely better than nothing at all. I think that should be on the table. This is the problem of having to ration justice. It's just an ugly reality.
Yeah, and tangential to that, to the chat, like, I also, like, do you really need a law school degree to be able to do things that people do? The idea of navigators is incredibly important.
And I think that we kind of generally talked on this question, but maybe we can circle back to it. And it kind of connects to what we're talking about now. Thinking about demographic data and AI discrimination in your work, the idea of thinking about AI and discrimination generally in the law. How does that, as it's developing, kind of, how are you seeing it come out?
Yeah, I think we answered this one on the feedback question and needing to be thoughtful. The question in the chat's fascinating. What kind of efforts are there currently to track
Yes.
and measure the effectiveness? I'm not sure at the legal service level anybody's doing that, but Jim, you would know better than I would.
I'm about to put hang on. I'm about to put something in the chat, but I can't talk and do that at the same time. Margaret Hagan at Stanford published a paper a few months ago called Good AI, Bad AI. And it's about evaluating AI, coming up with standards to evaluate the effectiveness of AI. As I understand it, what she was looking at was sort of direct to consumer uses of AI. So somebody puts in they need help with their personal legal problem. And they're not going to a legal services provider that's acting as an intermediary. They're going directly to an AI tool. How do you evaluate different AI tools in the accuracy of the information they provide in response? And she came up with a template and tested it. It was early, but she is. I don't know if you know Margaret. She heads the legal design lab at Stanford. She holds joint appointments in the Stanford Design School and the Stanford Law School. Really cool person. And she's looking at this. So that's something that's been flagged for attention, and I can't think of a better person to be addressing it than Margaret.
Yeah, I think another interesting piece of this to the question of, like, is it better than nothing, is access. Is the person trying to access it, do they have internet? Do they have the educational background? Are they literate? Like, all the questions that we think about when talking to our clients about, okay, maybe we'll do pro se assistance, or how can we help this person? Just because something exists doesn't mean that the people who need it are going to be able to access it. Is also, I think, interesting when you think about outcomes. Who is actually going to be able to use it? And it's terrifying, right? Because Tiana's point, what'd you say? There was 20 of these that people are talking about. If a person in Western Nebraska tries to find an AI to help them do a housing complaint, how are they going to know which one is the good one and which one is the one that's trying to steal their information?
You know, one good thing about generative AI in responding to an issue like that, the person in Western Nebraska who needs housing help, it's the difference between how AI handles that and how a Google search handles that. Google will provide you with a link to a website, but it may provide you with information on housing law in Maine when you live in Nebraska, and it doesn't understand that housing law varies from state to state. Generative AI, if you put in a question like that, the tools that I've used, the first question back is, where are you? It will ask for your location, and it will ask not only what state you're in, but what city you're in, because some municipalities have additional tenant protections that might not be available statewide. So anyway, it's just that's an
Sure,
improvement.
but yeah, absolutely
But
agree.
you're
Except,
right. But you're right. I
but
mean,
someone's gonna Google to find the AI, right? They're gonna type in like, give me an AI to help me. And if the first one that pops up is, no shade to Chuck E. Cheese, but Chuck E. Cheese AI system, that also scares me. Like, how do we, in addition to standards for AI, like how do we get the information out to the people who needs it?
Mhm.
Those are all the questions we have active in the chat, but feel free to mull it over for another minute or two if folks want to keep asking questions, or if there's anything that our panelists feel like any takeaways or thoughts that they want to make sure are included before we wrap up for today.
Yeah, no, this is something we talked about a little bit last time, but how are big law clients approaching this when they come to speak to you?
Yeah, so in my pro bono role, I feel like I get a little bit of, knowledge of that, but probably can't speak as ably about it. There, I think, we're getting a lot of questions about like, how are you using AI, to the question about tracking, in thinking about how we're going to start using AI. We're being told to really track the hours that are using. Are we actually creating efficiencies with using this? What are the results? And putting a lot of thought into, again, monitoring and tracking where it is actually helpful, or where, we can't just add AI to everything and assume there's benefits to it. So being critical about that. And I'll just say, like, I love this discussion. I really hear their concerns as like, there's hope that it can narrow the access to justice gap, but then I'm also concerned, Michael, and to so many of the points that have been raised, that I fear that it could also has the potential to widen the access to justice gap if we don't think critically about it. So just really welcome this forum and this community to be thinking about these ideas and giving thought to them.
I would love an AI that could take my emails for the week and put in my timekeeping. That would be, I would never again speak ill of AI. I think
Yes.
to the question in the chat, it sounds, and Jim, correct me if you think I'm wrong here, it sounds like you're using one of the free, easily accessible AI systems. And those are, one, tough to get good results from sometimes, but also you have to be very good at writing your prompt to get good results. There are, to Tiana's point, like trainings out there on how do you prompt an AI to give you the right thing.
Yeah, if the question is about the AI is exhausted, it's not, you need more information and you're not getting it. Well, you can't beat a dead horse. My solution is I go to another tool. Yeah, I give up on that one and start over and again with another AI tool and see what I get there. You do get different responses to the same questions using different AI tools. Not that they're necessarily, one is necessarily accurate and the other inaccurate, but you get different information. I try again elsewhere.
I think that sounds like it gets to the oversight. So pay attention to what you're getting if it's not working for you, versus just taking it and running with it, but try another place. It seems like there's enough variance out there that, to your point, Jim, you can try another tool and get a different result. I put something in the other day and it said 1 of 30 responses. And I thought, well, I don't have time to look at all 30 example responses, but that's kind of good to know. The first one didn't seem to really hit on what I was looking for. We have a question about whether the recording will be shared. Chris, you've already answered it because you're that quick. Okay, so thank you. They've got it. I already know that, but yes, this will be recorded along with all of the resources that were circulated in advance. A reminder that if you were thinking about, our reference to things from the last session and the recap there are links in the registration email. So if you've registered a while ago, and we all get a million emails, to Michael's point and timekeeping and all of that, it may be pretty far in your inbox, but your registration email did include those links. But fear not, you'll have a follow-up email for today where you can access them again, along with the additional resources that have been noted in the chat today. I think a lot of the discussion that we've been having in these last several minutes really do highlight the importance of community and conversation. I have continued to learn so much just in the conversations that I've had through Washington Council of Lawyers Best Practices in Pro Bono. I've learned a lot more than I don't know, I can't count the amount of emails that I'm getting about AI now, and they all just, feel like, squirrel, there's another one. I want to read that, but I don't have time. How do I keep up with all of this? And I think speaking with people, and a point that Jim made previously when we were chatting among ourselves, that the value, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but the value of engaging with those you trust and doing this work with other trusted partners can't be overstated. And so I know I value that. I think we have such a strong community through Washington Council of Lawyers and here locally in DC, but I know there are lots of us on this call today from other areas, other regions. And so whatever your community looks like, whatever engagement may be possible, as Washington Council of Lawyers has various sessions like these that do go outside of our local geographic. I think it's so helpful to hear what people are doing in other jurisdictions, what has been tried and tested. And I think to the point of resource gaps between our, for-profit partners and those without that type of community is so helpful. And I'm really grateful for the firms who are willing to share, who are willing to do trainings that have already been done in the past. I think that's one way that we can stay connected and try to create equity. We're not going to have the same budgets. That's just not where we are. But if we can share and continue these strong partnerships or create new ones, I think that can hopefully lessen some of the concerns. But I think for me, part of this discussion has been, don't shy away just because of the possible downsides or the fears, because I think we could miss out on real opportunities for our clients. And the community piece is just such a big one. So I'm grateful for all of you. Thank you for being in community with us today. Checking the chat, I already see the resources recap there from Chris. So if you want to check out what they put in the chat sooner than later and not wait for that email, you can do it right now. We appreciate all of you for the conversation, and we're still here for 10 more minutes if there are other questions that haven't been answered or other comments or things on your mind. If you want to share anything about your experiences with AI, what your offices are doing or not doing, we're happy to hear that too. So